Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Evening Stories Festival and this graphic detail panel. I'm Sarah Shaffi, and I'll be talking today to Jed Mercurio and Prasanna Puwanarajah about their graphic novel Sleeper, which is illustrated by Coke Navarro. Just to let you know that we'll have some time at the end, about 15 minutes or so, for audience questions. So please do prepare to ask some questions about Sleeper and about the writing process or anything else you can think of. But first, let's introduce them both. Jed Mercurio's most recent television series, Bodyguard and Line of Duty, have broken UK viewing records. Other credits include Bodies, Lady Chatterley's Lover, Critical, Strike Back, The Grimleys, and Cardiac Arrest. He's the author of 3 novels, Bodies, Ascent, and American Adulterer. Jed is a former hospital physician and Royal Air Force officer, having originally planned to specialise in aviation medicine. Prasanna Puwanarajah is an actor, writer and director. His writing and directing work has played at the National Theatre, the Royal Shakespeare Company and the London 2012 Olympic opening ceremony. He completed his directorial debut feature film Ballywater in 2021. And Prasanna worked as a hospital doctor in the NHS for 3.5 years. So if you can join me in welcoming Prasanna and Jed to the stage.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks very much.
Hello. Thank you both for being here. Really appreciate it. I'm going to start with getting you to introduce Sleeper to us. So for anyone that hasn't had the chance to read it yet, what is this graphic novel about? And maybe, I don't know, is it too much you take a sentence each and do it in 4 sentences? You can do a little back and forth.
Sure.
Who wants to start? Jed?
Sleeper is.
Sleeper is a space western about the return of an off-world marshal to the solar system for decommissioning, who then gets roped into a conspiracy thriller set on Titan.
One of the moons of Saturn. It's a mixture of sort of near future sci-fi, and we've really involved the idea of the Western, the idea of law enforcement, more in a Western model, and folded into that is the idea of this kind of lone protagonist who kind of fits the mold of iconic science fiction protagonists in the style of Blade Runner or Terminator. One of the key features of this character called DS5 is that he's biologically enhanced.
Yeah, and so his enhancements are physical and also neurological, and they start to fade and fracture and disintegrate as he goes through the process of working his way through the narrative of the book. And what emerges into him is the human that sits beneath all of that. So it also ends up being about our abilities to myth make and understand stories and abstract thought and stuff. So we there are navel gazing aspects to it as well.
We will come back to all of that in a moment, but I am going to rewind right back, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how the two of you know each other and how we'll come to how this collaboration came about in a moment. But where did you first meet?
We first met in an audition for Jed's medical show Critical, and I remember Jed sort of sitting there gnomically going, at my slightly dodgy audition. Then word came back that there was another part that he was interested in me reading, and ended up doing that role.
A bigger part.
A bigger part, yeah, it was a bigger part. So we spent 9 months shooting Critical in a studio in Egham, which is basically a bunker. And so we all got to know each other pretty well. And over the course of that time, we were talking about other projects and spaces that we were interested in. And so when the shoot finished, we met up and had a drink and a few meetings and stuff, and started discussing a few ideas. And Sleeper was the kind of end point of one of those little genesis points.
Yeah, I mean, Prasanna told me that he was also a writer, and I just thought, oh, here we go. and then he showed me this script he's written, and it was brilliant. And so I tried to say how good it was in a way that didn't sound surprised, and then just said, "Look, I'd really love to work with you. Because I think the big thing was the fact that we'd both been doctors, and we both had kind of a kind of sciencey way of looking at the world around us, which, to be honest, is rather a large contrast with most of the people we work with. And so I do recall some kind of very strange conversations where people were putting forward their sort of like crystal magic theories when they were talking to the two of us and another member of the cast who'd got a degree in physics. And it was very much us and them. So it just turned out that we had similar influences and similar ambitions. So it was really great. And obviously the medicine as well. We were doing a medical show, and there were times when there was that gap between what the script was and what the advisors were saying and what we needed the drama to do. And as two kind of ex-NHS SHOs, it was kind of like a snapshot of the NHS in the 90s for me, where like the consultants weren't there, so two SHOs had to figure out what to do with the critically ill patient.
So you said that Sleeper was the end point of one of the discussions you were having. How like where did you start with that discussion? Were you like, what if we had these sort of people that weren't quite human? They'd had their humanity almost taken away from them, and they were in space.
Well, it started in the doghouse in Kennington.
Okay.
I believe that's where we began the discussion at the pub there at Kennington Cross, and it was we were just talking about how to bring other genres into the science fiction space, and initially talking about something which was an out and out crime thriller or law enforcement thriller that was set in possibly on Mars or somewhere else, and that was then the starting point for the kind of the platform that we wanted to put the character on. And then we started having conversations about who that character would be.
Yeah, and we were talking about kind of the nature of iconic protagonists, basically, and like what makes them unusual, what makes them intriguing, but also what makes them revealing, I suppose, to us. There's something about the characters that Jed's mentioned already, where science fiction protagonists can be a real kind of human window, almost like spending time with a young child who's observing the world for the first time. There can be a way of refracting human experience quite freshly. So yeah, we were kind of talking about those things, and then it was a case of, I mean, it's just the practical work of sending back and forth ideas. And then going, that's interesting, let's nose into that space a bit more, let's leave that behind, let's sort of, and you eventually get to a space that for us actually is always, and Jed sort of said from the start, it's important, I think, with these things to kind of invent as little as possible, even though you're inventing everything. And so we try and tether it to relatively robust things.
Okay.
But we get to a point where we go, okay, here's a kind of world that we're interested in. Here's a protagonist and some features of the protagonist that we're interested in, and then it's just a case of kind of getting into the story and breaking down the story beats.
Did you always conceive of this as a graphic novel, or was it something else when you first were talking about this idea?
Well, we started off thinking of it in terms of script.
Okay.
I just think that's our kind of way.
Your natural will.
It's kind of our way into everything, although Prasanna does plays. So that as soon as
I was making a strong play for this to be at the Finborough Theatre. Actually, a couple of former colleagues of mine from the Finborough Theatre would have been thrilled to hear that. But it was television, and then Jed, it was Ascent, isn't it? One of Jed's novels has been repurposed as a graphic novel. So, sometimes it's just making television is about persuading a lot of people to part with a lot of money at high risk, and
a lot of money to make the show. I should say, not a lot of money for us.
No, it's very little money for us, actually, as it turns out. But actually making a book ends up being 3 people. There's us 2, and also a timely moment to talk about Coke Navarro, who is our illustrator, who is based in Valencia, who neither Jed or I have met ever. We've only spoken to, in fact, we'd finished the book before we'd actually had a conversation with his actual voice. So mainly it was WhatsApps, emails, which was a strangely robust process. There's no arm waving. There's no, maybe it's this. It's sort of, can that be a wider lens, or can that needs to drop into the background, or that we need to really feature this image. So
how did you find Coke, or how did Coke find you?
Well, he did a poster for a play that I directed at the Royal Shakespeare Company about 2 years ago, and when we'd started talking about this as a graphic novel, we were looking at artists, and I think the artists that Jed had worked with before had kind of moved into children's literature a little bit.
Yeah,
Did a little
I
bit
mean,
of
I'd gone
work
through the process when I did the first graphic novel of finding an artist, so I'd kind of been through that. So we kind of pooled our resources, and Prasanna suggested Coke, and we looked at his stuff, and then, I mean, because he's such a brilliant artist, it was really the next stage of the process that was key, which was his stuff looked good, but obviously it was it wasn't Sleeper, it was something else. So he expressed an interest in the project, and then he did some initial work, an audition, if you like, of illustrations, and it just blew us away. I mean, he totally got it. And the other thing about Coke Navarro as an artist is that he's a brilliant collaborator. It wasn't just that he said, "Okay, well, you guys tell me what to illustrate and I'll just do it." He was talking to us about what the story was and the character was and how these things would be rendered. So it was rather like the process that we're both familiar with of making television, which is that you have a script, but then there's a process of realizing it, which is, there's a plan, there's a blueprint, a storyboard, if you will, of how you're going to go about doing it. But with your key collaborators, like a cameraman or a cast or whoever it is, it becomes something that is refined in a particular direction. So it was an incredibly fertile collaboration.
So you mentioned there that mostly you talk to Coke via WhatsApp, and you said earlier that you were sending each other notes back and forth. I am curious as to the sort of the practicalities of collaborating on something like this. Did you sort of map out the chapter structure together and then go away and sort of write one each? And were you writing sort of instructions for some of the panels or the visuals as well?
Yeah, so we had a script, which was a screenplay, and the first stage was to work out what essentially the shot list was for the book, which is something that we do in our other jobs, which is about trying to work out how the story is told in image sequence, and that would be a kind of that's another 60-page document of this page, this image, and it's just blunt, dispassionate observations about what that frame is, who's in it, who's where, these sorts of things, and whether this is maybe this character's POV, or whether this is a establishing shot here, or whether this has some abstract features that are suggestive of something that we might see down the line. And then we back and forth that and kind of got that all going, and then we sent it to Coke, and he did essentially kind of line drawing versions, depictions of. But this is the thing that Jed's saying. He'd never just do the thing that he'd go, you don't need 9 images there. You need 7, because you don't need that bit. And he'd go, that's not going to work. Or we can, in some cases he'd go, do all of that, but there's a superimposition possible of this that might pull these together, these sorts of things. And
it's analogous to storyboarding an action sequence if you're shooting film or TV. That having the picture storyboarded allows people to look at it and say, oh, well, I don't understand how we get from that to that, so we might need more cells between. And then other times you look at what is storyboarded and you think, well, that shot isn't very different from that. Therefore, do we need both of those? Can we combine it into one that progresses the story?
And how was it for you taking a screenplay and taking that down to a graphic novel? Because I imagine the word count is quite a bit different.
It's actually really straight. I mean, because I'd done it before on Ascent as a graphic novel, where I'd taken prose to what you would call a script, which then got storyboarded. That was actually quite a lot harder than this, because the script tends to be full of the basics that would allow a person reading it to storyboard it in their head. It's basically what people do and what they say. So it was really about deciding what was the most efficient way of telling the story. And I think the major difference between making TV or film and making a graphic novel is the relationship between how the story is told and how it's absorbed. Generally, you're expecting people to watch an episode of TV kind of in real time. I know that in practice people pause and go back, or they drop out for 5 or 10 minutes and come back. But generally it goes at the same pace. It goes at the pace you're telling the story. Whereas with something that's a book, people have to actively turn the page. And that's something that you then kind of engage with, which is when you get to the end of a page, it's rather like the end of a scene, or even a cliffhanger at the end of an episode. You want to give them a sense of anticipation about turning the page, and when they do turn the page, the big difference is what they see laid out on 2 pages is a chunk of a story in advance, whereas in TV. The story doesn't quite work like that unless you're specifically doing a kind of reveal of things that you've hidden, and then you just lay it out. So we talked a lot about the interplay between how you create the thing on the page and how it's then going to be used by the consumer.
And you've talked a little bit about TV, and I am curious as to hear in more detail what things your TV works you sort of took from your TV work, or from plays, from theatre, and were able to sort of sit down and say, okay, this is a really good thing we've done there that we can also use here. But also, if the reverse is true, if there's anything, and I mean, I know you've done this process before, but if there's anything from creating a graphic novel that you're now going to take back and kind of perhaps think about, even if it's not a sort of a conscious, deliberate thing, back to that other work that you do.
For me, it's like it was kind of cartoons from the 80s. So and there's 3 things about those for me. One is a kind of really bold relationship with colour. Another is willfully preposterous setups and precincts and technology. And the third thing is actually just the elegance of the storytelling and the edit in those things. I mean, I've for various reasons, some of them related to Sleeper, but some of them just out of interest, gone back and watched a few of those things again, and they're brilliantly made, and they're brilliantly written and cut, and where the lens is at any one point is brilliantly well chosen. And so, and I think I'd sort of absorbed a feeling of that or something growing up. So that probably fed in. And in terms of feeding out, I think there's something. What I find particularly exciting about the graphic novel form is you can kind of, as Jed says, the act of turning the page could reveal anything. And a couple of times in the book we have put in moments of, oh, that's over the page. And it might be a full page image, it might be a block of text that's quite dense and unapologetically dense to just build world and push us into sort of other spaces. So that's something that I think in my other work I've just sort of gone, there doesn't have to be a set of rules. It just has to be coherent, and then something unexpected can be quite exciting.
Jed, what about you?
Well, all those things, but whenever you do anything subliminally, you absorb the visual language of it, so that when, say, I'm directing something, then as I picture how the scene is going to be shot, I'm kind of using a kind of library of visual memories of things that I've done before and other people have done, and this kind of just adds to that. I think in terms of the specifics, it's quite a technical thing, but it's also about use of colour, which in sort of film and TV is more analogous to a thing you'd call grading. And a lot of the stuff I'm doing currently would be graded very differently from this, but I could imagine doing a story that's more in this vein, where it would be graded to look like a comic book.
Okay. You mentioned sort of some 80s TV shows and kind of, I'm curious as to what graphic novels you both are fans of, and that you might have been thinking about. I mean, like you say, you're sort of, when you're directing, let's say you have this library, but are there graphic novels you particularly love or admire that you were kind of thinking of when you were creating Sleeper?
I'm going to completely put my hand up and say it's not a space that I,
Yeah.
up until this point, really knew well at all. I'd read Persepolis, I'd read Mouse, I used to read the Beano, but for me, it is a new form, and I kind of feel like I choose what I say quite carefully here. I feel like there's it's been quite welcoming, I think, for us to work in a medium that is new for us, but to bring aspects of what we do already into that space. And I think it's a growing medium in terms of like its mainstream capture, but it's been huge for decades in in kind of its own spaces in a way. It's interesting with like the big American studios that are pumping out like extraordinary adaptations of graphic novel work, how mainstream that stuff can be. But it's also the books are incredible for dealing with memory and grief and loss and travel and journeying and whatever genre space you're in. So that's the space that I just want to kind of get into. But I've been discovering it as we've been working on this process.
That's quite exciting, though.
It's really exciting.
Yeah.
It's really exciting. Yeah. But I mean, I absolutely do not apologise for this, but I very definitely Googled at one point how do you write a graphic novel? Just I don't mean like how do you write and how do you storytell, but what is the technical process of collaboration like? Because we do it, we know what that is. And a script is a delivery device for information as much as anything else. It's about how you talk to other creative heads of department about what's in any given shot or moment. I was, and I just didn't know what that piece of documentation was.
Yeah.
So, it's, I guess, like sometimes why you do something is about what you might learn from it as well as what you already know. So, it's all been kind of new for me.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of, when I was a kid, I read like 2000 AD and Marvel comics. I mean, back before Marvel was this incredible kind of cultural juggernaut that it is now. So as a kid, I was familiar with nearly all the Marvel characters that have since then been spun off into being massive kind of franchises. So I'd read Hulk as a comic before it was made into a TV series with Bill Bixby. I'd read I don't know, like Power Man Luke Cage before that was made into it. And so I was familiar with all of that anyway, and that then kind of fed in a lot of the time into the kinds of film and television that I was watching. So that was more my route in. I mean, since then, I've obviously read graphic novels that have been things that were much more grown up. So Alan Moore's work and which are fantastic, but they're obviously very different tonally from the kinds of things that I grew up on as a kid.
You mentioned at the beginning the mix of genres that Sleeper takes in. So there's kind of elements of the crime, the mystery sort of area, the western, the conspiracy thriller. But you're obviously taking those and giving those a new twist. How aware are you when you're kind of bringing in different genres of the existing tropes and trying to do something different with them, or is it much more of an unconscious?
Oh, we're using
process?
all of those. I mean, they're all. I mean, it's every story's been told. If you kind of get into it, do you know what I mean? It's the act of invention is about what's your personal offering to a story space and to a protagonist. What are you feeding in as three human collaborators in terms of your interests, your wishes, your dreams, the things that excite you, the things that terrify you. I think those are the things that kind of end up driving its uniqueness, I guess.
Yeah, I think from our viewpoint, as we said near the beginning of the conversation, the particular background we come from, means that we feel very comfortable kicking around quite complex science ideas, and that was something that we actually just enjoy. Maybe it was just an excuse to talk about space travel and biological enhancement, and it felt like we were working rather than being a couple of nerds.
We've definitely had conversations with people about this project where they've sort of gone, I mean, you guys really need to get out more.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask about the sciencey bits, which are a technical term for it, I believe.
That's what we say as well.
And I think one of you mentioned that there, I think it was you, Prasanna, talking about there's a couple of pages that are unapologetically text, and they're both articles. One is, I think, from The Lancet, and another is kind of a sort of is it a blog post? It's a travel blog. And they do quite a lot of heavy lifting science-wise, and I am not a sciencey person at all. I wonder how much of that was you sort of doing research and seeing what might be feasibly possible and then kind of taking it to the next level, and how much was just you being like, we're a couple of science nerds and we want to do this, so we're just going to do it.
It's complete invention. It's complete invention. But
I think it was just that we wanted to write a Lancet.
Yeah, I mean, I had, 1,000 years ago in my previous life, published an article in The Lancet about a very, very unusual lung condition that turned up one day on the wards. There's something about the particular language and lexicon of that stuff that is like willfully obscuring the kind of uninitiated reader.
It's also part of our training to do those things. You know, I didn't get published in that, but when I was doing medicine, I published a piece about the use of calcium antagonists to manage the side effects of prolonged neuroleptic use, and so you end up. Yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with it. Yeah, exactly. But it's part of your training to write in that way, and it gave us an opportunity to write in that way about some of the mythology of the character, and that actually came from a conversation we'd had very near the beginning, where when we started talking about setting it in space and what the kind of the life history was of the sleepers, these guys, I was reminded of a story that I'd read as a teenager that always stayed with me, which was Scanners Live in Vain by Cordwainer Smith, which is a fantastic science fiction story from the 50s. And there was just something about that, about this idea of the pain of space that was very 50, because obviously people hadn't been into space. And then obviously when people did go into space, they were worried about the Van Allen belts and radiation and things like that. And so this idea of space travel being painful was something that we started to look at.
Okay.
Yeah, and then it was a case of kind of working out, how do you write with as much detail and I guess like baked in authority within the context of that thing, but without it having to draw on too much in the way of, like neuroanatomy to really keep the reader out. And so that is quite a balancing act. But the hope is, particularly with that piece, is that actually what it's doing is just pulling back the curtain a little bit on who the protagonist is and what the kind of broader, as Jed says, the broader mythological landscape around that protagonist is, by looking at it really sideways through this editorial.
Yeah, and it's also obvious that I would never ever use jargon to alienate audiences.
So DS5, your sort of sleeper, isn't, when we meet him, isn't fully human, if that's the right way to say it. And I think it's not, I think you said this at the beginning, so it's not really a spoiler to say that eventually perhaps some stuff happens that makes him a bit more human, or a return to human. But human connections and emotions are really at the heart of the story. So there's another character whose father is missing, and she is also, she's a doctor as well, but there's this real sort of human need to find out what happened to her father. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about balancing those kind of very human emotions with the kind of the science and the technology and that sort of side of the story.
I think that's a great question. It's something that you're always doing as a storyteller. There has to be a human component to the story, even when the plot is being driven by the basics of thrillers, jeopardy and mystery. There has to be a human component to it, and so with this, what we really found was that it was one of the most profound ways in which the collaboration with Coke Navarro helped us. That just through images, you can give the character space and make the character appear lonely and tragic, and the same with other characters who have that arc. It's part of drawing the audience in and creating an empathic relationship with characters, even ones that are very different from anyone who can exist in real life. You know, if you look at, say, Terminator, there are aspects of that character, particularly as the franchise went on, that invited the audience to consider him as human. And you know, if you look at something, say, like The Fly, particularly the Cronenberg remake, there's something about that metamorphosis, that corruption of humanity that creates an empathic relationship.
Did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's watching someone not understand someone else's grief is a particular. It's an engine of interest, I think, because I think that's a bit of human behaviour that I think I think we see a lot, you know, and what I guess is like the hope with the protagonist is his attempt is to try and form some sort of understanding, not because he's morally good, but because it's operationally valuable for him to do that initially. And then as things change for him, he realises that there are other human dimensions in play that have to be brought to bear in order to form connections with other humans. Similarly, there can be a thing in grief where actually someone not entirely connecting with you can be what you need sometimes, you know. So I guess like there are interesting things to explore in that space, and I think those things always make procedural work richer, in the same way that the procedural stuff can make that stuff more intriguing and put it under pressure. So yeah, it was you know, there was always a sort of need for that kind of stuff to be in there, but all articulating with everything else.
So DS5 is obviously at the kind of our sort of main focus, but obviously this being partly a conspiracy theory, there is a whole lot going on in the world, some of which we find out by the end of the novel, some of which we're still waiting for or suspecting or speculating about. Can you talk a little bit about kind of getting in some of the sort of the topics or the issues and concerns? I don't really know the right phrase for them. So one of the things is that this world exists in the aftermath of a climate war, basically. So there's kind of some very subtle things woven in about the climate crisis. There's obviously a political dimension to this as well. There's sort of a nefarious senator, if I can describe him in that way. So talk about
that's your judgment. He might be a goodie.
He might be a goodie. Talk about weaving those in without sort of being too preachy about things like that, like climate change, because I think there's like a balance that has to be struck with these things.
Yeah, I don't think that was the intention anyway. It was purely that when we looked at trying to give a plausible reason for a presence in deep space, we had to come up with one, and you know, we've seen the sort of the first phase of the space age was about political rivalry, the Cold War, and we're now into another phase of space exploration or space travel, which is primarily commercially driven. So looking at commercial reasons why there might be a presence in the Saturn system was about, well, there has to be something there that's really, really valuable, because it's not cheap to go to Saturn and bring stuff back. So it had to be something so valuable that the major nations would embark on it as a commercially viable project. So therefore we were looking at energy and the idea that there was an energy source that was, you know, up there with fusion. And in order for that to be valuable, you also needed to look at why traditional sources of energy couldn't fill the gap. So it was purely going through the mechanics of it.
This is the first in a series. And I know, Jed, you don't really do cliffhangers, but I will spoil and say that this book does end on a slight cliffhanger. And obviously, you know, I don't want you to give us all the detail of what's coming next, but what do you hope for this sort of world and this series? Like, what sort of things might we expect in the future?
Well, I guess there's a couple of things. Firstly, it's about what happens with the mystery set up in this book. So his quest being completed, which is I mean, that's not really an answer, is it? But like, you know what I mean. But the other thing is, you know, are we setting up a protagonist that might exist in other spaces, in other precincts, on other worlds, maybe, and then it's about what's his ongoing relationship with his technical platform, and what's his ongoing relationship with his growing sense of his own humanity. So that's the sort of, you know, the broad shape for where we're going. But yeah, I mean,
are you working on the second
we are, yeah.
installment at the moment?
Yeah, we are. Yeah.
Anything you can tell us? Is it going well?
It's all right. Yeah, I mean, it's
Through it,
yeah, it's like I mean, any writing process, you sort of hate yourself for 95% of the time, and 5% of the time you kind of get something done.
Yeah, I worry when people think things are going well. It's like that means they've taken their eye off it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's a great collaboration, and we kind of send each other material, we send each other drafts, we look at things, but we also have, you know, a plan that we're working to, as Prasanna said, which is we want to conclude this story at the end of book 2, but we also want to be in a position where we can propel the S5 into further adventures.
Brilliant. Let's go to some audience questions. So we have 2 microphones, one on either side. So if you have a question, please put your hand up and we'll get a microphone to you, and we'll hold the microphone for you so you don't have to do that. So who has a question? Yes, right at the back there. And then if we can get the microphone on this side, to put your hand up again, to this person over here in the grey. So we'll start at the back.
I was just wondering if you think the creative industry would benefit from more like scientific doctory types joining, and then the reverse of, would the NHS benefit from doctors being encouraged to do more creative pursuits sometimes in their spare time?
What a brilliant question. I think both of those things would be good, yeah. And I feel like there is a practical approach to writing and creativity that I have, and I think Jed has, in like maybe not in exactly the same way, but you know, I think we're both quite structured, I guess, in our approach. It doesn't mean that we're less creative. It just means that there's a shape or like holding vessels for that creativity that we try and like grow. I think in the health service, I knew so many people who were and are in the health service who did things outside of medicine before they kind of went into it, and I think working in the health service has sort of been a kind of slow erosion of those things, sadly, and it is really hard. And I think finding the space and the time to be able to keep your creative spirit alive can be really difficult when you're a 40-year-old consultant in a pandemic, you know. But I mean, I've got a mate who plays in orchestras, amateur orchestras, and it absolutely is him at his happiest, which is no bad thing when he goes in the next day. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really good for people's mental health when they're doing pressure jobs to be able to have an outlet. And for me, I was a junior hospital doctor when I started writing. But obviously, although it worked out all right for me, I can't claim that it particularly worked out very well for the NHS, that I went and made loads of programs about kind of medical errors and things like that. But I think that one of the things that I was interested in when I started writing about medicine was that sometimes it was frustrating working within the NHS, seeing a version of it that was being presented to the mainstream media that was false, that was derived from things that didn't actually relate to the real experience within the NHS. It was related to other works of fiction about medicine, and just in terms of the scientific mind, I think that I feel like I've got a technical mind, and so when I got into writing, having not really written before, having not had any kind of artistic background at all, I stopped doing English at O level. I did science A levels. I went to medical school. I wasn't really a writer at all. So the technical side was much more about are there any rules to writing? How can you absorb those? And also then in terms of filmmaking, being able to absorb the technical aspects of how you shoot things.
Brilliant. Thank you for your question. So, question here.
I'm just curious, are there any other graphic novelists that you spoke to about that process of making a graphic novel?
Actually, there weren't. No. I mean, it probably sounds like we did no homework and kind of. I mean, I guess in a way, what we realised was, it in the end, it doesn't really matter how anyone else does it, because we had our collaboration with Coke, and we knew that the creative heart of it was good. What do I mean by that? That we all believed in the same things, is what I mean. And we all knew that we could turn what we'd started from into pages of images, and we had a process for it. And so it was kind of like, let's just do that and not worry too much about it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, because I'd done a graphic novel before, when I did my first graphic novel, I actually met with a number of illustrators who had been part of the process. So it was actually really interesting talking to them about what the practicalities were of how they'd worked with writers, and that really formed the model for how I did the first one, and that was something that then I kind of carried forward into this one.
Brilliant. So we've got two more questions. If we can get one microphone there and one microphone just here. Yeah, we'll start at the back.
Hi there. It's really exciting that you're working on a second one. I was just wondering, during the process of writing this first one, how much have you let in, or maybe even resisted, dreams and visions of a TV adaptation or a film adaptation of it, given that you both work in those mediums already?
Well, I think that the graphic novel has to stand up on its own. It can't feel like it shouldn't be a graphic novel. So we've absolutely focused on it hitting all the expectations of what a graphic novel should be, and that whole process. In terms of film and TV adaptation, there's a whole industry of that. Book scouts, and people are always talking about getting the rights to things, and that is always in the background of any publication. So that's kind of a case of watch this space, really.
Wonderful. Yeah, the question here.
Thank you. I kind of follow on from that question. I'm a bit of a dinosaur in that I like to read books not online. And I really like your idea of the end of each page being a cliffhanger. But if you put a graphic novel online, it's almost like a different medium. Yeah. And so have you thought about perhaps animating separate panels within the graphic novel?
Interestingly, I think we had a little piece of marketing that sought to do that, to put a bit of dynamic range or something into the images. I mean, we've not really considered it as an alt expression of this book. I guess the way that I see it is that there is movement in the space between the images. I guess like the joy for me of like reading picture books, I suppose, is the bit between the pictures is the bit that happens in your head. And so actually a huge amount of the book happens in your head. And so I guess a gesture towards animation probably robs you of a little bit of that, in that it wouldn't be a full animation, but it would also sort of lessen your need to add that sense of movement and journeying from picture to picture. So, yeah.
I think also the process tends to be focused on the physical book. It's like if you write a novel, you don't write it with one eye on what the audio book would be. I think that the whole creative process is really about the thing that certainly has always made me really love writing novels and being involved in graphic novels, which is that idea of the reader somewhere physically having the book in their hands and having that experience. In the same way that I kind of, when I first started writing for TV, I had this idea of what the relationship was between the program and the viewer, which was based on my own experience of loving certain TV programs and just giving them my full attention. So when early in my career I encountered the cynicism of the industry, of people saying, oh, you've got to remember that, you know, people are watching your program doing the ironing, you've got to take that into account. I always pushed back on that. So I think that when we create these works, we always imagine the most functional possible relationship with the audience or the reader.
It's interesting actually, because a recent colleague of mine had bought the book on a tablet, and was just showing me the platform, and it was. I mean, I think I would say if anyone was interested in the book, buy the book. But if you can't, then yeah, get it any way you can. But as Jed says, the primary medium is tactile paper.
Yep.
But it was interesting watching this. You know, it was quite a process to read it online. It was kind of like you'd have the image and you'd double click and the picture, that frame would be enlarged. Then he would address that. Then he'd go on to the next image and it would be that, which is sort of what you're doing, saccading across a page with your eye. But it's a wholly different experience to holding the book in your hands and addressing each frame. I mean, you know, my partner read the book in about 5 minutes. Just scanned it, you know, kind of picked up a first pass. And I know people who've sat with it for a whole weekend and pored over it, you know, image by image, looking for little clues, looking for little kind of tags, things that might lead to, you know, so yeah, it's a communion, I think. I mean, I hear what you're saying about like wanting to have the book in your hands. I think it is that. Nothing wrong with dinosaurs.
I think it's interesting what you say, because I think unlike fully prose novels, with a graphic novel, there is a way of you turn the page and you sort of you see all of the cells in one go,
sure.
And then you also and you kind of you know, you follow, there's a path for you to follow depending on the positioning of the speech bubbles, or kind of, you know, all of that sort of technical stuff.
Well, we had, I mean, there is a colour hit on each page, so we tend to, it's by and large 3 colours on any given page, not any given double page. Sometimes that's a double page. But the experience of seeing that whole page is one thing, and it's an emotional thing about the colour choices and the colour ranges that are on that page as distinct to the ones that preceded. And then, as you say, yeah, there's the sort of work through. There's also the thing of knowing that both pages are different. And so you're coming to a kind of some sort of like breath in the book that's taking you into a new place. And that's something that you're feeling because you're seeing a kind of a hue across a whole thing. So, and you miss that if you don't have it sort of in your hands, I guess. So.
I suppose in some ways it is, I don't know, a graphic novel is quite close to TV in a lot of ways because there's a visual language that you are taking in at the same time you're taking in the words as well.
And also related to those old choose your own adventure books. Do you remember those ones where you had to like work out what you did and like
I always died on page
Oh
one.
yeah, but I'd have my hand in the book like that so I could retrace 5 goes
From where you went wrong.
Yeah, exactly, and go down some other route. But I think there's a kind of adventuring through the book as well, which is really useful and part of the journey and part of the joy of it. Everything in there, whether it's the sketchbook at the back or the images that title each chapter, has been kind of, I would say, lovingly created and intentionally created to be clues and references, and but also just like good like finely drawn images and things like that. So
yeah, wonderful. Have we got any more questions yet? So we've got one on this side, and then there's one right at the back in the corner. So if we can get that mic ready as well, please.
Thank you. Oh, thanks. No, a slightly off-centre question. But I didn't know anything about your book, but it sounds very interesting. I came because I'm going to the members' screening of Blade Runner this afternoon, and it just occurred to me, and I haven't read any graphic novels since Superman back in the day, but any thoughts about, would you recommend any music to listen to whilst you're reading the book?
interesting. I think I have a playlist somewhere.
Oh.
From back in the day when we were kind of piecing together. I mean, one of the things that I do personally when I'm writing or directing something is put together a playlist of things, and it may be the things that I think are referencing that work, but also things about how I'm feeling about certain particular aspects of it. Yeah, I mean, what would I suggest? Theme tunes from 80s cartoons and soundtracks from 80s sci-fi would be a really good starting place. I think maybe your screening this afternoon will tee you up nicely.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, I enjoy the screening. Sounds fantastic.
Amazing.
Jealous.
Thank you very much. And there was that question right at the back there.
I was actually just trying to write in my notes, so hopefully it comes out. But at the beginning of your careers, how did you both feel when you made the transition from the world of medicine into the world of film and TV? And what advice would you give to somebody making a similar transition?
Oh, well, firstly, welcome if you are making the transition. I'm really proud of being part of our TV industry. I think it's fantastic, and one of the things that I always am grateful for is the fact that I was welcomed in and given opportunities, and I think it's really important that those opportunities are passed down. And so it's great when people come in who have their own kind of sets of skills and life experience that are maybe distinctive and offer something different from maybe the conventional way in, and certainly that for me, because I'd come from a background that wasn't normally associated with working in a creative industry, that there was a bit of a steep learning curve of learning the language of how you describe things and how you look at creative ideas and developing that sense of collaboration on things where there isn't a right or wrong answer. Coming from somewhere like medicine or from aviation, there was a sense that there was a right answer or the best answer or the best solution to a problem, and it was your job to know it or to learn it. And I think in the creative world, that's not necessarily true. That some of the best work actually comes out of people discussing things and breaking new ground, which obviously does happen in research settings, but generally when you're treating sick patients or you're flying aeroplanes, you're not really looking to discover something brand new. So that would be my answer to that. But if you are coming into the industry, fantastic. I hope the industry welcomes you, and I hope you have a fantastic career.
I found working in the health service really hard, actually. So leaving it was really good. Actually volunteered. We both did actually. We both volunteered to go back into the NHS at the start of the pandemic last year. Jed got a fairly early no thank you, I think. He was.
Well, I
fairly
didn't
long in the
actually
tooth.
get a no thank you. What I got was a drop down list that didn't have how long out I had been.
Yeah.
The number of years since you'd practiced
Yeah.
kind of ended at
And-
like
Yeah.
on the drop down list ended at about 5 years.
And you'd been treating the pharaohs and stuff back in the day. But no, I got a no thanks. I mean, like as you can imagine, it's quite a rejection being told that you're not wanted to
During
work as
a
a doctor in a
pandemic.
pandemic. It's like it's kind of a new low. But
we did all. I mean, the thing is, there was also a way back in. I mean, that there were people who would have got us back in, but then it was obviously maybe not in the best interests of the NHS. to have
Exactly.
people had been out as long as
sort of
I
floating
had,
around.
yeah.
But I think the reality was, the thought of it made me really, really anxious, and it reminded me of that time. And so, it was a transition of like going sort of along a energy gradient that was quite permissive. I was quite I was happier in the insecurities and unknowable spaces of this industry than in the ones of that one. And I would say in like
I'm the opposite. I kind of
Yeah,
I did. I enjoyed being a doctor, and it really suited me. But also, I think recently I'd ended up going back to my old squadron and actually sitting in the aeroplane, and I just felt very comfortable. I just kind of felt this. Actually, this is more me.
Yeah.
Is kind of what I remember thinking. Whereas, I feel very fortunate and privileged to do the things I do, but I also realise that, I'm better at other things.
But yeah, just to reiterate, like, welcome, and I would say that the industry needs you and needs your stories. So, good luck.
Unless they tread on our toes.
In which case, come and work with us.
Yeah.
Good luck. I think we have time for one more really quick question, if anybody has one. No? Okay. Well, we will end there.
Can I just say thanks everyone for coming out?
thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks,
you.
Thanks for coming out on a Sunday. It's
Exactly.
been an
Just sort of,
absolute pleasure.
and there
Thank
are
you.
roasts to be eaten and things like that. So
Well, thank you both so much as well. I know you're very busy. You are.
Yeah, I'm going back to. I'm actually shooting today, so I just came from the set, and I'll be going back.
Which is very exciting. I heard an ooh. So do you want to say what you're shooting? Can you say what?
Yeah,
you're
we're actually shooting two things today. We're shooting Line of Duty 7 and Bodyguard 2. No, we're not.
But it is something else, and I really appreciate both of your time today. I really appreciate all your questions. Jed and Prasanna will be going downstairs to the Waterstones desk to sign some books. So if you want to get your book signed down there, if you were too shy to ask a question in public but you want to ask it there, I'm sure they will be happy to have a chat with you. But in the meantime, thank you all for coming, and please join me in a round of applause for Jed and for Prasanna.
very much.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think we just go down.